Okay. Today we are privileged to interview Dr. Zaidi, who is professor in chair of language and literacy in the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. Her research expertise focuses on multilingual literacies that clarify intersectional understandings across sociophobia, diversity, immigration, and pluralism. We are excited to delve into Dr. Zaidi's expertise and explore two of her notable works. The first, co-edited with Umit B. and Morrow E., is the fascinating publication titled Transcultural Pedagogies for Multilingual Classrooms, Responding to Changing Realities in Theory and Practice, published in 2023 by Multilingual Matters. This book promises to be an important resource addressing the changing dynamic of multilingual classrooms while also providing insights into practical applications based on both theory and practice. Additionally, we are eagerly awaiting the release of Dr. Zaidi's paper with co-author Sa P.K., titled Multilingual and Multimodal Literacy Interventions to Explore Youth's Intersectional Identities and Racialized Experiences, a scoping review, which will be published in Sage Open shortly. Thus, a scoping review uses multilingual and multimodal literacy narratives and discussions to help immigrant youth understand their intersectional identities and experiences of inequality while offering a comprehensive overview of the current landscape. Thank you, Dr. Zaidi, for joining us today to share your knowledge, and thank you for sharing your time with us.
Sure. So basically, historically, we have we've seen so many different movements in the field, right? And so it seems that from my perspective, the more I read, the more I was aware of this whole issue of constant movement, constant displacement, so many cultures, so many languages, so many linguistic repertoires, and the whole idea of social interaction and how this is mediated. And on top of that, you add the intricacies associated with social media as well and digital spaces. So it makes it all the more fascinating. So I guess the thing about the trans approach for me is thinking about elements like social groups and languages, not as fixed conceptualizations, but really something that is in constant movement. And so what distinguishes, I think, what's the most interesting thing, and an opportunity, I think, for students as well, like yourself, exploring this whole dynamic, is the idea that in this constant movement, there is change also. And obviously, we'd need different mechanisms to measure the nature of those changes, or to get a sense of really the extent of, how much change is being introduced. But the assumption is that change is not just one-sided. That is for the individual or the system that we're talking about, that is the incoming into a mainstream context. This could be anything. In this case, I look at classroom-based practices, obviously within the context of a country like Canada, where we're talking mainstream versus minority contexts being brought into that mainstream context. So what's interesting is thinking about these relationships of displaced languages, and thinking about social groups, and thinking about all these different, people that we can almost consider as actors in these dynamics, and how everybody is, by virtue of being in that context, somehow associated with change, right? And so that's what's super interesting, I think, as a starting point, just being cognizant about that. Obviously, starting from that perspective, that sort of puts us in an interesting situation where in comparison to, previous perspectives, because what that allows us to do is to examine this whole notion of change from the perspective of ourselves as well as individuals who are in contact constantly with that change. So needless to say, the person who's coming in is obviously learning, but we too are learning from that contact. And so that brings us to again, that whole idea of communication that is two ways, communication that kind of is moving away from things like a monoglossic paradigm that we talk about in our introduction, and communication that recognizes that, it starts with recognition and that looks at things like plurilingual dispositions from an additive perspective. So I think that would be a starting point. I'm just thinking what else would be obviously the whole idea of positioning as well. So things like, how do you position yourself from this perspective? So the idea that, when you think about transcultural repositioning, I think we're cognizant of things like identities. Identities are dynamic, they're hybrid, and they're also transcultural. They're obviously influenced by the local particular practices, but they're also acknowledging this constant movement. So, for example, the original context that they're coming from may not necessarily be the dominant feature of what is redefining them in, for example, Canada. Because the assumption is, or students who are new to the classroom from different places and spaces are redefining some of those practices that they've been introduced to in their local context or in their home context, and they're giving it a new shape. They're expressing it through different, for example, cultural and artistic forms. There are different ways of seeing and thinking about this whole notion of hybrid spaces. And that's, for me, I think the most exciting part of the transcultural, the trans approach that allows us to then engage in so many different ways. That's a good question. So the thing is that, I mean, we have seen through historically all the great work that's been done, for example, by experts like Jim Cummins, who has time and again reiterated the importance of collaboration, the importance of being cognizant of power dynamics, the importance of, taking whole school based approaches to discuss and bring about some of these changes. So I think that one of the biggest challenges probably that we have in terms of teacher education first is that, this recognition that everybody is a language teacher. So it doesn't matter what context or what subject matter you're engaging with in the schooling system, given that we're all up against this complexity that seems to be characterized by languages, but is also characterized by multimodality. It's also characterized by things like faith-based literacies, so many different aspects that then are a part of what we can term as this whole repertoire that individuals bring into classrooms, so translingual and transcultural practices. So the thing is that any educator entering the system has to be cognizant of the potential. First of all, recognizing that, such complexities exist is a starting point. So this recognition can come into play through different things, practices that can be introduced, some basic, ideas of just being more aware of the socio-cultural dynamics of your place and space where you're teaching, for example, being aware, having some basic knowledge of the geopolitical scenarios from where people are coming from. Now, that said, obviously, people could argue that these aspects keep changing, which they do, depending on what's going on in the world. So, for example, there was this great need a few years ago to focus on Syrian refugees coming into the country. So that would be packaged in a different way. So being cognizant of some basic skills and sets of repertoires that I think everybody should be aware of, recognizing that identity is dynamic and fluid. So there's no such thing as somebody from Syria representing an epitome of culture that's a blanket statement that will, apply to anybody else coming from that part of the world. So being cognizant of the multitude of ethnic, geographic, linguistic, and all these different forms of identities that essentially compose these individuals that we would be teaching in classrooms. So that would be a starting point. And that is not actually that difficult to do, in my opinion. So having credentials that have some basic attention given to things like language, culture, what are the primary elements that compose these core constructs that we recognize as being important. So language, culture, identity is a starting point. A multitude of literacies is another starting point. So having these as core, seminars in teacher education programs is a starting point. So as an example, in Western Canada, in Calgary, we have a basic seminar that everybody is required to take on language, literacy, and culture. It doesn't matter what you're going to teach, whether you're a high school teacher or whether you're a generalist, you're expected to take that course. And in that course, there are the instructor walks students through all these different scenarios where there is this discussion, for example, as language being considered as a means of social justice and activism. So language is considered as a primary starting point for bringing about this discussion that would be additive and that considers the elements that people are bringing into a class when they're coming from different places and spaces. Of course, there's this additional, discussion around advocacy and the fact that, it's no longer enough to be talking about things like English as an additional language, because the fact of the matter is that you're surrounded by that phenomena. So I think we're long past the stage where we'd say, okay, we're going to run this course or that course. Yes, that's all very much needed, but there's a broader discussion of, okay, transcultural practices, trans approaches that are part of everybody's repertoire. So I think that is a means. Then there's this additional need for basically focusing on things like culturally sustaining pedagogies or change, because there's this idea that, historically we've been in these moments where we have had the opportunity to basically focus on various aspects of diversity, language being one of them, and then it sort of gets lost after that moment has passed. And then, you're back to square one. You realize that 2 years down the road, you're again having that same discussion with people, okay, about the same things that you talked about 2 to 3 to 4 years ago. So it's almost like a cyclical thing which keeps repeating itself. So to get past that roadblock, I think that change has to be brought on a whole school level, on a system level. Change has to be brought to getting everybody on board. There has to be dialogue. We currently have a big initiative running in Western Canada where Rural school divisions are all on board. They're at a stage where the diversity factor is becoming one of the highest in the country because of employment in places like meat packaging plants, where most newcomers are directed who have minimal language skills. They arrive with their families who are then entering these schools, and different ethnicities, different, faith-based backgrounds, different requirements, and a very homogeneous teacher population that hasn't necessarily been exposed to such things before. So how do you get everybody to work together and then basically have a model that's starting from the grassroots level, and it's then trickling down the system. So you're tackling the same issue, but you're tackling it on so many different levels. So teacher education programs is definitely a starting point, and then the type of professional development that is being offered across school divisions is another form of engaging. I myself am working on things like critically engaged workshops with teachers, where art-based interventions are being introduced. So art combined with language, combined with a focus on things like identity, and that don't necessarily just focus on the linguistic element, but really are way broader than that, and brings in this whole idea of trans, which is the crossing over and the blend of different possibilities, even a focus on things like place and space-based approaches, where you're developing an understanding of how people who are coming from different places and spaces, particularly the young population in schools, whether it's elementary, middle, or high school, how are they developing a sense of belonging and presence in their new space? So what is it that they're using the most to develop this sense of belonging, and how are the teachers assisting them? And what is it that we can do as experts to promote those kind of, um, orientations? Good question. I mean, I don't necessarily have the answer to all of these, questions, but it's a good question. It kind of, makes you think about, okay, so what is it that's happening? So I think that, I mean, throughout my career, I've certainly been more aware of how Canada is definitely leading research across the world, in the sense that there's something about our country that allows a better, more flexible orientation within the context of education. Education has certainly taken into account what's happening politically across the country. So, I mean, being an officially bilingual country, there is that in itself has been a good starting point for us to recognize the implications of multilingualism, of course. But I think historically, we've never been in a situation like this before, in the sense where the diversity factor is now very, very prominent. So we are definitely we have entered a new era, in the sense that before, perhaps there used to be certain pockets in the country. So, for example, Toronto has historically always been an example of communities that have settled down here, chosen to settle down here. So obviously, you've seen a lot of the policies being influenced by the diversity factor. But interestingly now, across the country, that movement has taken a completely new dimension. Just as an example, I think recently in the National, they quoted that interprovincial immigration has gone up just between Eastern Canada and Western Canada. We had, I think, 60,000 people immigrate from Ontario to Western Canada. So, I mean, the landscape has changed so much now in Western Canada. If you drive in neighborhoods, you'll see all kinds of languages represented. There'll be pockets of neighborhoods where you'll see, different types of schools or programs being offered. There is an awareness at a system level within the boards of education, special priorities being discussed at all levels, whether it's within the political arena or the educational arena. There's an intertwining. So I think that these are all good things that are happening. Obviously, I mean, that said, we are probably not moving fast enough in that direction, in the sense that the demand is more and the supply is less in terms of, training that's being provided, or even from an interest point of view. It's not necessary that all our teacher candidates coming through the program or being licensed are wanting to take up diversity or equity related issues as a focus. However, that said, I think one of the things that has definitely happened over the years is that identity has been examined from multiple perspectives. So before perhaps a decade ago, we wouldn't have seen that much of a discussion within boards of education or classrooms around who you are, where you come from, what your interests are, and this awareness that, we definitely need to bridge the gap between what's going on in the homes and what's going on in schools, and the awareness that languages do matter. And so an additive model has definitely been propelled in a variety of ways. And as I said earlier, in Ontario, you've probably seen this a lot, but this has definitely grown in different parts of the country due to the diversity factor. So that's a good thing. I think in terms of how newcomers are feeling in terms of being in the school system, I think there's a recognition in research that we're dealing with a student population now that is different, in the sense that with this explosion of digital spaces, forming a part of who we are as individuals, and people being exposed to, for example, live exposure to wars happening in different parts of the world, live exposure to change, within seconds you're following what's going on. So it's no longer a question of, oh, we're going to hear about this perhaps in 24 hours. You're actually in a situation where young people are at the heart of these conflicts, right? So they're very aware of what's going on. So current affairs is a part of the backdrop that we're dealing with, and their positions being taken with respect to that, and their different types of phobias, social phobias that are being tackled by in the form of different advocacy that you see in the youth growing up. So I think that we are definitely fostering a stronger generation of younger people who are more aware of their roots, who are more aware, and who are not afraid to take up many of these controversies upfront and have discussions around what matters, what their position is. So the educational systems are no longer devoid of these discussions. I think they are politicized. They are definitely dealing with that. So in terms of mechanisms to measure some of the unhappiness or satisfaction, what I can say is that in my research and the kind of art-based interventions that I've been working on in Alberta, we have seen a lot of satisfaction and push for advocacy for this type of work, using things like walking narratives where students focus on safe places and spaces in schools. Where do they feel safe? Where do they feel that it's okay to use their first languages? How are they dealing with that intersectionality piece that is being at the forefront of sort of you're something else at home, you're something different in the school space. But there's also this recognition that it's okay to be different, and there's a lot of like strength that they draw from community, and there's a lot of push on the part of the students to bring community into the school. So even if the parent lobby is a little quieter, the students themselves are advocating, and they're not afraid to advocate. So I think that's a big change from before. And I attribute this to the pandemic. I attribute this to a lot that happened during the pandemic, things like Black Lives Matter movements, where students are into that sort of advocacy. Historically, it has existed, but I think it's become more vocal and loud now. And these are all good things, I think. So we're in an interesting space from a research point of view, from an advocacy point of view. Social impact is bigger, I think, because through social media, it provides you with the ability to, bring change. So, for example, we have young people in Alberta who are part of an Instagram movement where they share their thoughts about language culture. So you can actually follow them on Instagram. There is they have been to AERA last year in Chicago, where there was a group of students that went with the administrators and myself to Chicago to receive the Youth Teams in Education Research Award, where essentially this is exactly what it was about. That is, how are you feeling? How are you living these experiences? And what about social change? And what about systemic change? And how do you make that happen? And certainly I can say that, these students are providing professional development to teaching staff in Alberta, where they are the ones doing the professional development, not the teachers themselves, but the students are showing, educators what they would like to see happen. And they're talking about the problems that they've experienced, whether it's connected to racism or any kind of, discrimination based on accent, language, how you dress, how you talk, different cultural practices, needs that they have in the community. So there's a lot of advocacy, and I can say this much, that the administration is extremely cooperative, and they're listening, and they're learning a lot. And so I personally haven't experienced any kind of roadblocks in terms of, all is moving in a direction that it's growing in that sense. And that's what you want to see happen, right, at this stage. Great question. I mean, needless to say, participatory action research does provide you with the connection that you need in the field. So action research, PAR, both of them show promising results from that perspective. I think I'd say it's very difficult to pick either or, but certainly based on where I'm going with my research right now, I'd say the strongest potential is for me is PAR, with this idea that you're looking at engagement through the arts. So that provides a mechanism where you can bring in the community. You can bring in, it has the potential to engage multilingualism from a perspective where you can bring in parents, families, support staff. The administrators themselves, in many cases, are multilingual and willing to engage in various, segments of work that's happening. The youth themselves, in this case, I've done a lot of work in high schools more recently. In my initial body of work was more focused on elementary, and then I moved into middle school, and now in the past couple of years, that's where the demand has come from. So I do a lot of work with young people in high schools, so they themselves are taking charge of what their needs are. They're defining some of those agendas, and we are basically providing them with various frameworks that are then reflected upon through engagement with administrators, through engagement with teaching staff, through involvement from community members. And so then basically finding mechanisms of youth advocacy that can speak to mainstream populations. So the youth are keen on, for example, engaging with their peers in schools where they may not necessarily have been able to make friends with people outside their own community. So they're keen on having a dialogue about, difference, about different practices, about asking them questions and forging friendships. And the art-based provides you with a means to basically first reflect, express yourself, reflect on the various, scenarios that come to mind in terms of, experiences of being perhaps differentiated from mainstream people in society, and why that's happening, and what are some of the reasons, and how are you reacting, and what change would you like to bring about through the dialogue that we're engaging with. So cyclical, basically means where there's a lot of focus on dialogue at all levels, and through that dialogue using things like, feed-forward cycles, where you basically then learn, change, and then adapt and move forward. So action research, whether it's collaborative, I think is an effective means to go through that change that you would like to see. Participatory is also good in the sense that it engages the staff in some of these changes in ways where you see many things happen. As an example, in Western Canada, through the work that I mentioned earlier, where the youth were nominated for the Youth Teams in Education Award through the American Education Research Association last year, they basically went, as a result of the work that my team did with them, they went to talk to the superintendent in the schools where it was a predominantly Muslim population in rural Alberta near the meat packaging plant. And they felt that every year they would, for example, the month of Ramadan would come and they wouldn't have a holiday for Eid, and they would be marked absent. So they went after, as a result of all the dialogue that happened and the work that was done, they actually went to the superintendent, who brought it to the board of trustees, who actually voted in favor. And so it was the first step of its kind in that jurisdiction, in the entire, Western Canadian area. So now they have Eid as a holiday for the entire school. It's not just for the students, it's for the entire school. So, I mean, lots of discussions about what the demographics want, how are they, and so that change, I think, was a part of the action research work that was done on the ground. And the cycles enabled us to kind of narrow down some of the core things that students wanted to see happen in the system. And so the change, another example would be around things like Blackness. So, coming from Black communities, what are some of the challenges that they're facing that people don't even think about, and sometimes take it for granted? So, how does a discussion on language, culture, identity open up that space for students to actually bring forward examples? So, another example of that is after Black Lives Movement happened, the Black students in a particular high school in Western Canada basically decided that they were going to create a PowerPoint to educate the entire school about Blackness. So what does Blackness mean? Why is it a problem? And why are they engaging in this discussion? what's the history and why, what kind of language and vocabulary do they find problematic when they engage in any kind of debate with their peers in the school. And so they went around, they were given permission by the administrators to do that. And now that whole debate is very much a part of the leadership vision in the school. So it's not limited to just the students going from class to class, but it's kind of taken a life of its own. And as I said, if you actually go on this Instagram account for the school, you'll see all kinds of things that have emerged from on the ground work, where students have been posting constantly different, snapshots. So project-based work that came out of the Action Research Collaborative, initiatives that were launched, and now the art-based interventions that are looking at workshops and basically developing workshops that engage all kinds of stakeholders in this discussion, and then produce artistic, works that are then basically showcased both provincially and nationally. So I have a collection of a virtual art gallery exhibition that's on in Alberta right now, and at a theater in Alberta till April 9th, where newcomer families, entire families have been part of this project, and they have created identity texts in the form of collages. They have multilingual postcard stories about their fears around language, culture. They have different, thematic issues around letting go. So how do you let go, and how do you develop resiliency, and what kind of a story do you tell to mainstream audiences? So that exhibition is both there's a physical exhibition, and then there's a QR code that actually takes you to a virtual art gallery. So if you send me an email later, I can send you the QR code for that, or the link, and you can look at those examples. And then you can also look at the Instagram account that I was referring to. So yeah. So it's this whole idea of intersectional spaces, and it's this recognition that youth are often caught up in these places, and younger kids as well. It's difficult to basically characterize that whole space, and it is certainly defined by things like language, culture, identity, faith-based practices. But it's also defined by place and space. So now we're looking at an era where you're kind of at the crux of literacy studies, so multiliteracies, multimodality, but also language-based work that kind of combines all these different areas to basically talk about things like how do you define growing up, for example, in a place and space where you're new in a country like Canada? What are the affiliations that are being developed? And of course, intersectionality is at the center of this, because there is the whole idea of public culture and private culture, and intersectionality would be defined by different linguistic practices, different forms of being in places and spaces, as well as the geographic space itself, like a whole discussion around how do you feel in certain places and spaces, and what is it about a place that allows you to be who you are and truly, authentically. And so that's kind of I think the next stage of work that I would say is interesting.
Awesome. Thank you so much. So Dr. Zaidi, at the end, we wish to express our heartfelt gratitude to you for sharing your wealth of knowledge and ideas with us today. Your expertise has helped us widen our idea on education, transcultural pedagogies, and the complex dynamic of identities in the context of literacy interventions. We are excited to apply these newfound insights to our continued pursuit of education excellence. And thank you once more for your insightful and for helping us, for your sharing your knowledge and time with us. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. Thanks, everyone.